Hello, my name is Mila Turajlić, and I'm here at the Sharjah Biennial talking to wonderful people from La Grande Tour. And happy to talk to you about my work. What I'm presenting at the Biennale are essentially different strands from a long-term research project called the Non-Aligned Newsreels, which is based on trying to reactivate forgotten archives that were made by Yugoslav cameramen, I'm from Yugoslavia, for non-aligned countries and liberation movements in Africa in the 60s and 70s. And it's really looking at this archive as the manifestation of gestures of solidarity that have been forgotten and trying to figure out what possibilities they contain as we look at the current moment. So one of the strands that was commissioned by the Biennial has to do with a workshop that we developed over the years, where we take material that was filmed in the 1950s and 60s in Egypt, in Sudan, in Ethiopia, in India, Indonesia, Tanzania, and as we scan it and try and think through this material, because it's very fragmentary, there's no sound in the material, so it's really about trying to kind of make it legible again. We take it to the countries where it was filmed, and we do a public call for participants who come to these workshops, which are essentially silent screenings, and they do a kind of live improvisation, so they engage with the material as they discover it, and they try and bring to it their own readings, reflections, commentaries. Sometimes it takes a tone of very intimate stories, so we kind of witness a kind of intergenerational transmission, because often in the workshops we have an older generation that maybe remembers the era that they're watching, and then a young generation telling us how and where they kind of interact and engage with the material. And so we did one in Sharjah in October, and what is behind the wall is essentially the result of that workshop. And it's conceptualized as a diptych, as a two-channel installation where you get to see the material and at the same time the person who is watching it. And I find that it creates a very interesting triangle because there's you observing someone observing the material and bringing you into its reading in a very different way. So that's called the Voices from the Debris, because it is a question of finding a new political voice for this material and kind of creating a new political vector for it to be read today. That's this work here. There's a kind of introductory research explanation of the provenance of the footage, because it's very much footage that's kind of resurfacing after the political shipwreck of Yugoslavia. The workshops are really the core. Because this material was created as a gesture of solidarity, I was looking for a way to reenact that gesture. And so the ability to take it to the place where it was filmed and sit in a space where people whose story it is, whose legacy it is, discover it, and in its discovery share the kind of effective value of the footage was already extraordinary. We did a recent one in Maputo in November, and what I do is a very quick explanation of the provenance of the material, just so that people understand how Yugoslavia enters this story, why Yugoslav cameramen were given these tasks, why Yugoslavia found itself in this role of giving cinematic aid to non-aligned countries and newly independent countries. And then, for example, what happened in Maputo is that it was a very intense political moment for the country, and it really comes at the 50th anniversary of their independence. And a young generation is absolutely questioning the kind of memorialization of this struggle, and to be able to sit there with them and have that conversation, witness their conversation with the images, but also ask them questions and really try and understand what is the legacy of the past and how is the cinematic image now a carrier of a national story, but then also of contestations, and how can it be turned into a counter-archive by this young generation. That was absolutely amazing. Really special. And it really felt like we had reached the core, the heart of what we were trying to do, that the material had really found its place again, in a dialogue that kind of springs around it. When we do a public call for workshops, we're really hoping that we'll have like a spread of ages, because what's also been beautiful is really to assist in this intergenerational transmission where older people speak of what they remember and the young people hear that, but then vice versa, we have the young people kind of telling the old what they think of the past, but also the present situation. And so for me, as I watch a young generation that hasn't grown up with the story of the third world, if it hasn't been transmitted to them at home, they wouldn't have heard about it in school. I come so often across people who have never heard of the non-aligned movement and feel like they've been deprived of a story of their past. And so it's the question of having grown up in a world where we were told that there's only one kind of correct way, one correct political system, which is this liberal democratic system, and they haven't been given the instruments with which to think through possibilities or to think through other potential political futures. And so I really feel that witnessing this encounter with the material is also witnessing a moment in which their political horizon expands. And that's been really rewarding. So this section is a second strand coming from the Non-Aligned Newsreels project. And we've called it Gestus, the image in three movements, because it's essentially a look at one specific aspect of the archive material, which is material filmed for liberation movements during their anti-colonial struggle. So we've been working with three films that we've recently digitized that are held in the Yugoslav newsreels. One of them dealing with the Algerian Liberation War, the second dealing with the Mozambican independence movement, and the third dealing with the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And so the whole idea was to take a look at how the militant image, because this material is being filmed by people who themselves were partisans during the Second World War and the Yugoslav resistance movement, how they brought their aesthetics, but also their politics into making films for the Algerians, the Mozambicans, and with the Palestinians. And the idea was to use this space to create a dialogue between those three movements and to show how these solidarities are actually going from one struggle to another and how the militant image is evolving in its grammar. So there is this idea that there is a language of militant cinema that begins to develop its codes of representation, that begins to develop a kind of its thematics. And the idea was to try and use this space in order to lead you through a reflection and investigation of those invisible linkages, essentially, between these liberation movements.